Good evening, everybody. Welcome to this meeting of the Centre for Geopolitics on Security and Vulnerability of NATO's Northern Flank. My name is Brendan Sims. I'm the director of the Centre. We have a very distinguished and informed panel to discuss this extremely topical issue this evening. On my right, we have Laurie Bristow, former ambassador to Afghanistan, but of course also to Moscow, and now president of Hughes Hall. To my left, Kristina Spohr, professor of history at the London School of Economics and Political Science. Kristina has written very widely on the international history of Northern Europe, particularly also on the question of NATO enlargement and everything to do with that. To Laurie Bristow's right, Nora Topor-Kalinskij, who is a senior political and regulatory advisor for EDF Trading. And I stress that the remarks she will make tonight are in her personal capacity. She's not representing EDF as such. And then to my far left, Sally Walker, former Director of Cybersecurity in the UK Ministry of Defence. No longer, of course, which is why you can be here with us this evening. So the format of this meeting is that we'll begin with a short report from Adam Ware on a simulation exercise we carried out in the course of the day. Then we'll move to a panel discussion, and then we'll have audience questions and discussion. So as Adam is going to tell us in a minute, this meeting is a fixture in the Centre for Geopolitics calendar. It has risen out of a series of simulations that we've held over the years, which involve the Baltic Geopolitics MPhil class and figures from government who come up from London to simulate through an exercise. So without much more ado, I'm going to call upon Adam Ware, former student on the MPhil course, but now organizer of this simulation, to tell us a little bit about it.
Great. Thank you, Brendan. I'll just give a quick flavour of what it is that we've done today and why we've done it. I think this series of what we call strategic simulations arose from a sense 7 or 8 years ago, originating in good universities and in popular discourse that the world was changing. Geopolitics was a term and a phrase which was becoming much more current, always known, of course, to academic circles and diplomatic circles. But in some senses, the study of geopolitics had become somewhat ossified and stuck in a sort of Cold War kind of paradigm. So we thought we might try and crack that open a bit by setting up a series of events where we bring the MPhil students who are working with Brendan in the study of geopolitics, both in the very broad sense, but also as applied to specific regions, with people in government who are charged with analysing geopolitical kind of events and advising ministers, and then a sort of rich cast of former and still serving people, ministers, secretaries of state, admirals, generals, air marshals. We've had them all, and they are most welcome. What we tend to do is we set, at the beginning of the day, a complex start brief, which replicates what might happen if you're working in government and something bad has happened overnight. You'll get some news reports, you'll probably get a call from somebody in your office, and you'll be waking up in a bit of a frenzy, trying to work out what's going on, and you will be called to a meeting in central government, chaired by somebody important, the Home Secretary, the Prime Minister, the Foreign Secretary. And there begins the business of trying to make sense of what you're dealing with, at the same time as what you're dealing with is still happening in the outside world. And what we want to do for the students is to give them a sense of the cloud of uncertainty that attends a crisis, particularly in the first flush. And what we want to do for the people still serving in government is give them the chance to reflect on the way they behave and how they take decisions in the current climate, because up here, when you're away from Whitehall, you're absent some of the pressures, particularly from real life and the risks, and also from ministers and their demands. So it's a chance for people to reflect on how they're doing their jobs and what may need to change. And then it's also a great opportunity to draw on the experience of people who have been there and done it for real life, including these panellists here. And we are very honoured to have Charles Clarke, the former Home Secretary, acting as our Prime Minister. And as we discussed over lunch today, he had chaired the COBRA that took place after the 7/7 bombings in London. So he knows what it feels like to be in a chair taking those sort of decisions. So I'll just give you a quick flavour of what the situation was that we were looking at today, and then hand over to the panels and some key points that came out. When we did this event this time last year, we actually modelled a Russian sub-threshold type attack against Estonia. And one of the things that we quickly alighted on was the vulnerability of the Nord Stream pipelines in the Baltic Sea. And we didn't know at the time how prescient that was, but it did show the utility of this sort of format, because we ended our day then, all of us, a bit concerned about the vulnerability across Northern Europe in that regard. So moving the scenario on, what we were trying to do today is look slightly ahead into the future. So we were taking into account some of the key strategic changes that have taken place over the last year. Of course, the invasion of Ukraine, but particularly we were looking at the hiatus at the moment whereby Finland and Sweden have applied to NATO but have yet to be granted full access, and as some of you may be aware, in the interim have signed a number of security agreements bilaterally, including with the UK. So we wanted to test what would happen if and when Sweden, Finland and others came under some sort of threat, and that was the context in which we were working. We had a number of esoteric elements thrown in, as we always do in these things. Those of you who really know this area may have heard of the Åland Islands, which are Finnish territory but guaranteed neutral by treaties which date back to the immediate post-First World War period. We had an Attorney General in the room to advise us on obligations and other considerations legally. And as we moved through the day, we were made aware of a range of activity around the region and the wider region into the Atlantic and so on by the Russians that may or may not have had ulterior purposes, may or may not have been hostile in intent, but altogether were quite confusing. We worked through our scenario, and it was all it's all covered by Chatham House rules, so I'm not going to go into the sort of detail and the outcome because there were plenty of government people in the room, but suffice to say, we ended up with a few key things which I think will be explored here, is that building on what we now know about the vulnerability of our undersea power connections right across this northern European region, we looked at also the vulnerability of the undersea cable network in particular that carries our communications. There are a number of highly interesting elements which came up around where responsibility lies for protecting that infrastructure, particularly in international waters. And we also spent a lot of time, as we all do in government, pondering what the actual intent of the actions and the signals that were being transmitted by our adversaries. So it was a full, enjoyable and stimulating day. When we finish, we ask everybody to feedback, and we build that feedback into the next event. And the aim overall is to continue, if you like, a sort of active, practical colloquium between academia and practice in geopolitics and international affairs. We hope to the benefit of all. And if anybody is interested in hearing more about it, participating in the future, please seek me out.
Thank you very much, Adam. So I'll now turn to our panel, which I should say is very kindly sponsored by Citigroup. In fact, we've got three visitors from Citigroup in the audience, and I hope they will bring some of their experience into discussion subsequently. So, as you've heard, and I think you probably don't need much persuading of, there are considerable vulnerabilities on NATO's northern flank. I'm now going to turn to the panel to elucidate some of those, perhaps concentrating on those areas on which you have the most expertise. So I'm going to ask Sally, for example, about cyber and Nora about energy. But I'll begin with Kristina. You're the historian of geopolitics here, but also someone who studied the contemporary situation very closely. What, in your view, are the main vulnerabilities that NATO is experiencing at the moment on the northern flank, and which ones do you think were flushed out in our deliberations in the course of the day?
Yes, I think when we talk about the northern flank, we focused, of course, in our simulation very much on the Baltic Sea area, and I will talk about that primarily. But I will also make a few comments considering that the northern flank, of course, also includes Norway and Svalbard, and therefore the Barents Sea region, and also in that respect, perhaps make a few comments that pointed to the Arctic. So as regards the Baltic Sea area, of course, currently we have the problem that we have two aspirant countries who have lodged their applications but are not yet NATO members because neither Hungary nor Turkey have ratified their applications, although there have been made noises that this should happen, certainly in the case of Hungary by February and Turkey perhaps by the summer. We cannot be sure. So that brings out a certain vulnerability when we think about the geopolitics in general. And if you have the map in your head, and you consider those areas, you have to think of the Danish straits as straits which are also relevant to the Russians if they want to reach further international waters to the west, because Russia has the exclave of Kaliningrad sandwiched between Lithuania and Poland. There's also the awkwardness with the Suwalki Gap, where Russia hasn't got direct access to Kaliningrad, and of course it is an ice-free port, and otherwise being sort of stuck in the northeast with St. Petersburg area. So that's how it looks from the Russian perspective, and if you consider from Russia's side what it means that Sweden and Finland will join NATO, then you have to consider the strategic implications for the islands of Bornholm, a Danish island, where of course very closely to that, right opposite Kaliningrad, we saw the blowing up of the Nord Stream pipelines. And then Gotland, the long Swedish island, directly opposite Kaliningrad, and on the between Finland and Sweden, the neutral demilitarized Åland Islands that are also not fortified because there's no permanent stationing of military. So if we think about military activity and the Russians also doing exercises, including with the Chinese, as we have seen in the recent past, that of course has taken place in international waters, but accidents can happen, and in any case they are the ones who will feel sandwiched by being basically surrounded in the future by NATO countries. So the scenario played a bit with the idea, if the war in Ukraine is going badly and they want to create disruption, what would they do to these strategically important areas by Sweden and Finland? That pertained to cyber activity and trying to bring down electricity grid, nuclear power stations in Sweden, one on the Atlantic side and one on the Baltic Sea side, opposite the Åland Islands, and raises then questions of the electricity grid, how electricity is provided, in the case of Sweden, very much by nuclear power and hydro. Now you have to consider hydropower depends a lot on weather. Has it rained enough? No, it hasn't, particularly this year. So for our scenario was also important, not just a cold winter, but also when those reserves are low and you can't really use that sustainable electricity provision, and it's nuclear, and then you have cyber attacks on your power stations. However, Sweden is linked into a grid with Finland, Norway, and Estonia, and that brings us then to look at the Finnish position, where energy is coming, electricity is coming very much by nuclear power, and Olkiluoto 3, the new nuclear power station, is just this month going fully on grid, and that will mean that Finland will be, in electricity terms, completely self-sustainable, but it also had to deal with the cutting of the gas supply, and therefore had to move into the Baltic Connector pipeline across the Baltic Sea into Estonia. So since this year, that particular pipeline between Paldiski in Estonia and Inkoo in Finland, 77 kilometers, is an important pipeline because it leads to the gas storage in Latvia and the LNG terminal in Lithuania. It means that we have a Baltic-Nordic connection, but of course with them not yet being in NATO, that would be areas that could be disrupted. Another potential to blow up in the international waters, at least, if you so want, if you don't want to make a direct attack by going into territorial waters. And also the question of data cables, communication cables. Again, we had a very interesting map where we can see it's really across all over the Baltic Sea area. And we know from experience in the Barents Sea, if you think of the recent Svalbard incident where the Russians with their deep submarines were able to cut the communication cable there. So we know that they have machinery and willingness to try and hamper those kinds of cables, and that of course creates a threat. So that was the scenario for the Baltics we looked at, and we could of course consider that Russia is nervous. If Finland is a NATO member, it gets that entire long border along a NATO country, air defense, air policing, there's constantly of course airspace incursions, and that would connect up with Norway and all the way into the Arctic. And we must not forget the Kola Peninsula is heavily fortified with conventional and especially the fleet, the northern fleet of Russia.
Thank you very much. So that gives us a sort of panoramic view of the challenges facing NATO in the region. We'll come to energy in a minute, perhaps in a little bit more detail, and maybe also look at what it means for this country. But before we do that, I'm going to turn to Sally, and whether you could tell us a little bit about what might be the challenges in the cyber world, communications world.
I could. It's a really difficult subject to tackle quickly and well. So if there are any true cybersecurity experts in the audience, I'm going to apologize in advance, because I'm going to speak in very general terms, which means that the specifics are wrong. We live in a digitally dependent society. So in any sector, everything that we do relies on our technology working properly. And in every sector of society, there is someone, somewhere, looking to ensure that our technology doesn't work properly and to exploit that vulnerability. So in a scenario such as this one, we are looking at an infinite problem with infinite variables, because the answer is absolutely everything is vulnerable all of the time. And there are two things that we can think about and debate amongst ourselves. One is the intent of the adversary, for which we have to have insight or better intelligence to understand exactly what they are trying to do, when they're going to do it, and why they might be seeking to exploit our vulnerability. And the second is our own state of affairs, our resilience, the vulnerability of particular sectors, the expertise and specialism that is applied to defending those sectors. And that goes well beyond traditional defence. It relies on the citizen and their behaviour to a certain extent. It requires the support of our corporate organisations, our critical national infrastructure. And that is a huge task. And government has done really good work in this space. The Centre for the Protection of Critical National Infrastructure, if I've got that right, CPNI, do a lot of work to assess the vulnerability of the UK. But the reality is there's an awful lot more work to do. We have people who are looking to make technology operate outside of its design specification. If you go to a cybersecurity conference, you'll be shown how to stop a kettle from working, part of the Internet of Things. Who cares about kettles not working? Perhaps you do. Perhaps you really depend on your caffeine in the morning, as I do. But that Internet of Things vulnerability demonstration shows that there's a control system that can be attacked. There's a chip that can be attacked. There's a communication that can be attacked. It doesn't get into the navigation of a kettle. If anyone's got a kettle that can move. You need to think about that as well. But for a kettle, perhaps it doesn't matter. But if you've got a warship, or if you've got a nuclear power station, or if you've got every communications device on the planet, or if you've got the GPS systems that underpin our financial transactions and the movement of our transport networks and our logistics supplies, and we have really quite considerable vulnerabilities to consider. So I was asked last week, what does a cyber attack feel like? And the only way that I can possibly describe it credibly is to say that we're moving from perhaps blood and gore war and shock and awe war to the boiling frog war. I used that line with the Chief of Defence Staff about a decade ago, and he laughed and then went silent. And that's the other feature of a cyber attack, is that everything goes silent. You can't communicate with people. You can't rely on the things that you use in your day-to-day life. You perhaps don't have the insight or the intelligence picture you used to, because you've got gaps in your data, you've got gaps in your understanding, so you're adding to the ambiguity of your entire baseline. So cyber warfare is something that we find difficult to game through. It's complex, it's challenging, and it's very different from a lot of the challenges that we have faced as a society, as a government, and as an interconnected system of thinkers. Is that enough as an introduction?
Thank you very much. So you've emphasized very much the issue of interconnection, and that's cropped up already in the context of energy. Nora, could you perhaps elaborate a little bit on what Kristina was saying, and perhaps also explore for us a little bit the question of, to what extent what happens in the Baltic Sea region affects the UK, but also in a sense can be cordoned off.
Of course, yeah? Of course. So I think we need to first take a bit of a step back to situate the global kind of energy context within which we're operating. We have a war in Ukraine which has pushed the EU, the UK, so Europe as a continent, to try to move away from Russian energy supplies. Now, it will come not as a surprise to most of you that we are incredibly dependent on Russia as a continent for energy supply. However, we also have a number of other key partnerships. One of these, very importantly, is Norway. And so it is through that lens that I will kind of approach this question. Norway is really important for the general stability of the European continent, both in power exports, but very much on gas. Right now, if we take a step back to February, March, April, May, we had a very intense process within the EU to try to force the filling of gas storages where possible. A lot of that has been quite successful. The new policies that were put in place delivered in many countries. Storages are filled at more than 90%. This is a very good place to be for the winter, except for one thing. If our interconnections on gas with Norway are broken off and we get a very cold spell, we might have a physical shortage of gas molecules. Now, this all seems a bit theoretical, perhaps, but this is where we come to the specific implications, as Brennan was asking. For instance, if we take the UK, but this is applicable to other parts of Europe as well. In every country, you have some contingency planning. So you may all recall these headlines about rolling blackouts that we had a few months ago. So this is part of standard contingency planning. Effectively, if you don't have enough gas or enough power, there is a step-by-step process to try to shut off users to decrease demand. Typically, this starts by some industrials, and it can continue up to the full emergency level where you get something like rolling blackouts. I think what's really important to stress is the political implications of something like this happening in Europe. If a player like Norway were to be pushed out of the equation, you will get stress across Europe between the different states. Now, there are a number of agreements between countries about helping each other in case of shortages. The reality of it is, if there is a gas shortage, it's probably not going to go as smoothly as written down on paper. We had some very good examples during the COVID crisis in terms of sharing various equipments, supplies, etc. So this is a political vulnerability in terms of the coordination of NATO as an alliance of states and the ability for national governments to actually come to a common front if there is a case of attack or some suspicious activity happening. So definitely an international vulnerability there. But also it creates a context where it's much easier to exploit domestic disarray. Again, coming back to this example of the blackout headline, the time when it came about was just a regular exercise that happens every year to check what the contingency planning is and if anything needs to be updated. Because of the political situation, it was blown out of proportions, it made international headlines. So you can imagine what would happen if this were actually triggered. We live already in an environment where, post-COVID, with prices going up, standards of living falling, there is a lot of mistrust in the government here and across Europe. You can see similar patterns domestically. This would only be exacerbated in such a situation. The domestic media would jump onto any opportunity to say that the government has lost control, that it is incompetent, etc. You need to couple that with the longer-term costs of any economic disruptions that would ensue from such energy disruption, as I mentioned, shutdown of various industries, shutdown of various services, etc. So again, because we're coming out of a wave of COVID and then high prices in energy, this would only be a much higher burden than previously. Now the question is, can any of the scenarios be contained? What you were coming at, Brendan. Absolutely yes. And this is also, I think, one of the strengths of these emergency plans is the idea is to try to prevent the spread of any kind of national disruptions to neighboring markets. So each transmission operator, national regulator, government has a responsibility towards their own people, their own economy. So there will be an effort, for example, if some of the nuclear capabilities are down in Sweden, we have that in our scenario, to try to kind of ring fence that. So it shouldn't go beyond a regional impact normally. But I think the core thing, and this was mentioned earlier, is the undersea infrastructure. If that gets disturbed, potentially the consequences will be much broader, both from an economic but also political standpoint for NATO members.
Thank you very much. So I think we've got an even wider sense now of the array of challenges. So I'm going to turn finally to Laurie to ask you whether there's anything we've missed in the many different problems, but also perhaps to invite you to reflect a bit on something that's cropped up with both Kristina and Nora, which is the idea that actually we're looking at a wider space. It's not just the Baltic Sea region, but also the Arctic and High North. And Norway, and in some ways it doesn't make much sense to separate these spaces. So if you'd like to lead off on that, that would be great.
Thank you. So, listening to the discussion today and actually the presentations just now, I'm kind of come back to the importance of geography, actually, in all of this. I should just say by starting, I think we came to the conclusion that Norway is really, really, really important in terms of how we understand the UK's and the Alliance's interests and vulnerabilities. And just to illustrate that, if anybody has not seen the series Occupied, which went out a few years ago, with what at the time felt like a fairly far-fetched scenario, with Ingeborg Dapkuniete playing the hatchet-faced Russian ambassador, essentially overseeing the takeover and installation of a puppet regime in Norway. So I might go back and watch that, actually, as a result of that. So, geography. One of the things that's really struck me about the conflict we've been dealing with in its current acute phase since the 24th of February this year is how important the flanks are compared to how important the centre was in the Cold War that ended with the fall of the Berlin and what happened after that. What I mean by that, evidently, the main theatre of confrontation, direct or indirect, between Russia and the West is now the Black Sea region, which was thought of, as not quite a sideline, but it wasn't the main action for many, many years and decades. Linked to that, I think there's a discussion that we might come back to a bit later about another part of that geography, which is the Eastern Mediterranean. So I'm thinking here particularly of the impact on our interests of the Russian military and political presence now in Syria and the Eastern Med, but also the ever complicating and evolving picture around the Cyprus dispute. And at the heart of this, Turkey. Turkey strikes me as a country that was pretty important to us for a very long time, is now absolutely central to how we think about our security for the foreseeable future. Of course, the other flank is the Baltic. And so what we're dealing with here is a stupendously complex physical and political geography, starting from the fact that we extended the Article 5 commitment to the 3 Baltic republics explicitly on the basis that we would not attempt to place substantial long-term forces there capable of repelling a Russian invasion. What we've now got is a situation where Russia has brought about something really extraordinary. So just to, what a difference a year makes, just to run through a bit, a partial catalogue of the consequences of Putin's misjudgments, epic strategic misjudgments. So we've got a more unified and a more far-reaching set of responses from NATO, the EU, the G7 and others than anything I've ever seen since the end of the Cold War. Second, a complete turnaround in the German position with regard to dealing with Russia, so moving from really generations of a logic that said that the way you deal with Russia is you try and bind it into a mutually an arrangement of mutual dependency, essentially. And what Germany found was they created actually something rather more ugly for their purposes. And we're now seeing the effects of unwinding that. Again, a complete turnaround in the German position, at least on the face of it, in the Zeitenwende, with Germany's approach to Germany's defense. So, actually now talking about putting money in and capabilities in that will bring Germany within sight of NATO defense expenditure targets. We'll see if that actually follows through. But just bear in mind that only a couple of years ago, this was the major bone of contention within the alliance between the Americans and the Germans. Could well come back. The other one, by the way, I think is Turkey. Again, go back to Turkey here. Sweden and Finland overturned several generations of westward-leaning neutrality in a really staggeringly short period of time, really weeks actually, to turn around both public opinion and policy in both of those countries. And the really, really interesting thing here, Russia's reaction was essentially not to react. So I'm not really sure what conclusions I draw from that, but I think it is telling us something about the internal logic of the Kremlin's position here. In a context where the arguments have tended to be presented by Mr. Putin and his colleagues as pushing back on NATO expansion. Well, Russia's actions have just brought about an absolutely first-order expansion of NATO in terms of politics and capabilities in a part of the world that is of first-order importance to us and to Russia. So I was just thinking that one through. I think part of my answer to that, apart from just miscalculation, is it's trying to unpack, what Russia thinks it's doing and why. For me, a very large part of what Mr. Putin chose to do this year is actually about Russia's sense of Russia itself, its identity in the world, and the concept of the Ruski mir, the Russian world, and this underlying inability, unwillingness to accept that Ukraine is actually a sovereign country capable of making sovereign choices. Final point, I think, it's we touched on this from different angles already. It's the extreme complexity of that confrontation. So when we're talking about critical national infrastructure, cables, pipelines, shipping routes, we're talking about essentially our economic interests. So this is a confrontation that's playing itself out not directly in the military space, but indirectly in terms of our vital national economic interests. Just my final point on this, lurking somewhere in the background, which we touched on a number of times today, is China.
Thank you. Yes, we'll come to China quite soon. But let's just stick with Russia for the moment. You've already addressed the question of what Mr. Putin is trying to achieve. It might be worth exploring for a moment what current Russian capabilities are, so far as we understand them? Because I think there's a general view that Russians have suffered setbacks and indeed strategic defeat in Ukraine, and that therefore they lack the capacity to become active in the Baltic Sea region or the High North. And that may be true, but it may, on the other hand, not be true. And I just want to ask the panel's view on this. I mean, one thing that emerged today was the point that whatever the situation with the Russian army in Ukraine, the Russian Northern Fleet is still intact and very capable. So I don't know who'd like to comment on that, but while you're gathering your thoughts, I'll turn to Sally on the cyber issue. What, in your view, are still Russia's capabilities in the region that one would need to look out for?
I think it's still a big unanswered question, because in the cyber world, those capabilities that can be seen, those operations that have got a visible impact in the real world, are those that are designed to be seen. Mm-hmm. So the question has to be whether they're being used for messaging or for genuine intent in their own right. The Russians are demonstrably in Ukraine not operating as we had feared, with that full integration of cyber capability into the military operational space. So we're not seeing virtual attacks lined up with physical attacks in the way that some might have anticipated. I think that's surprised the community at large. And we've got to remember that isn't, therefore, a playbook of how to do cyber operations well, and there's plenty of examples going back through Afghanistan to ISIS and way before of different approaches. So the question is, where is the Russian cyber A-team? Does it not exist? Has it been dominated by intelligence voices, and therefore any risk to serious capability is being withheld for a different conflict at a different time? Or is something else playing out?
So, Nora, on the energy front, you've already described some of the issues that have arisen and that are well known. But is there any sense in which we should be waiting for the other shoe to drop? I mean, are there other possibilities open to Vladimir Putin on the energy front to make what is already quite a tricky situation worse? Or has he shot his boat?
No, I think, I mean, there are some additional steps that could be taken, in the sense that we still have, if we look at pipeline gas, level of flows coming from Russia, which is far lower than what we had previously. But the lower the flows, the more difficult it will be, for instance, to refill storages in the coming year, rendering actually next winter more of a question mark than the current one, which was the one we all initially focused on. So I think that there is definitely some action that is still left. I think one of the main questions right now is what is going to happen with Russian oil. So today you have the beginning of the EU sanctions on Russian oil imports. There are a couple of exceptions, but broadly speaking, it means a ban for Russian oil imports into the EU. At the same time, you have another measure which has been adopted by the G7, which is saying that above a threshold of $60 per barrel, it will not be possible for companies that are housed in the G7 member states to provide services such as shipping, insurance, etc., to Russian oil shipments, regardless of their destination. I think watching Russia's reaction on this latter measure will be particularly key, because it will show to us what level of resilience the Russian government still has in terms of budgeting. So this will play out in the next couple of months. But if we see substantial steps from Putin to try to move to some form of negotiation, even if it's recognizing a stalemate, at least signing a ceasefire, I think that will be a good tell on the economic situation. And of course, energy plays a massive role in Russia's budget and in feeding the military war machine.
Thank you. So in other words, even if Europe and the West were to get through the winter, would not by no means be out of the woods.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So one of the things that Laurie mentioned was Germany's role and the change in Germany's position, which has been much discussed. And yet in some ways, Germany seems to be an actor which doesn't really gain the traction that perhaps it should in the region. And I'd like to turn now to Kristina. You, of course, know both the region and Germany extremely well. And so one of the things I was wondering was what your assessment is of this famous Zeitenwende, whether it is actually being pushed through or operationalized in reality, and whether we can expect a more upfront German engagement in the region, and what your assessment of that is.
Yeah, we can. I mean, it's an interesting moment in time because we are actually effectively 1 year now into the Schultz government. He signed he entered this Chancellor's office on the 8th of December a year ago. So we can look at 1 year of Schultz and we can look at 8-9 months of Zeitenwende. He, of course, came into power very much focusing on trying to preserve and conserve how things were. He wanted to be like a Merkel #2. That's what the Germans wanted, to know the stability. Didn't really have a foreign policy agenda and was fixated on social reforms and digitization. And of course, that has been up to a point derailed because we have then entered this new perma-crisis. Not that we didn't have a perma-crisis under Merkel already, and all of us here in Europe, but everything that's happened since. And it was surprising that the man who on the one hand in Germany is called Scholzomat because he's so quiet and speaks in this monotone way. On the other hand, when he was competing against the other chancellor candidates, said that he's a little smurf, he's cunning, and smurfs always win. Whether that's the way forward with Putin, I don't know, because we also remember Macron and Putin sitting like lame ducks at that long table in Moscow just before the war broke out, because they actually believed it perhaps wouldn't break out. Zeitenwende, it's a big term in German language. Of course, Zeitenwende is really like epochal change. In fact, today in Foreign Affairs, Scholz has published yet another article under Zeitenwende, calling it not just an epochal moment or watershed, but an epochal tectonic shift. And I read that just before I came here to sort of see how that tallied with his first speech. So the speech was big. It talked about a revolution in German foreign, defense, and energy policy. It talked about Germany, the sovereign united Germany, now 30 years since unification, stepping up on defense spending, that special 100 billion euro fund that was also sort of placed into constitutional change, that would be available, plus that Germany should be spending the 2% of GDP as the NATO target suggests. Of course, NATO itself is talking now about 3%, and Germany is saying that relative to its own GDP, actually, even if it spends 1.6, what it's doing right now is already a lot of money. But it is at 1.6%. Actually, in Jane's report this week, you can see again that it has hardly shifted at all. The Ampelkoalition, the traffic light coalition, you have to see that the Greens and the FDP are as far away from each other as they can, and the German defense minister from the SPD, Lambrecht, is also stepping from one problem into another. So actually, the usual problem in coalition politics, but in this coalition in particular, that actually to really cohesively move forward doesn't seem to be happening because it's pulling in different directions. And also by Germany, for example, in the EU context, spending 200 billion based on debt finance to support the energy price caps in Germany hasn't made everybody else in the EU happy, because they're saying, well, Germany is just doing its own thing in its own national interest. Well, nations like to do that, but the Germans press always for multilateralism. So on this occasion, no solidarity, fixation on the own country. And then now let me come to defense. Yes, a lot of talk on defense spending, which not a single penny really has been spent. Certain deliveries have been made to Ukraine, especially the IRIS-T, the machinery to shoot down missiles. But very small numbers of the best type of military equipment. Of course, Germany is saying that they prefer to act in concert with others, and there one could say then critically to the United States, well, if the United States helped more publicly with public suggestions to go along with the Germans so that the Germans wouldn't feel so exposed as that European power, perhaps that would actually help, would make the Germans more confident. Because the constraint isn't just the coalition, the constraint is also simply still history and that culture of restraint that goes back to the semi-sovereign West Germany. And I would like to make a comment here that we should not forget that, of course, the Bundeswehr, especially if you think of the 70s, Chancellor Schmidt, NATO dual-track decision, that kind of period, Germany was, on the continent, the strongest conventional army. It had 500,000 men on the West German books. Of course, after unification, technically more, but through the unification and the 2+4 treaty, actually Germany, as part of the compromise with the Soviets and Americans, Britain and France, actually led to a decline, to a shrinking of the joint forces from what would have probably been some 700,000-800,000 men to 350,000 men. Plus conscription was finished. So a lot actually has to do with that post-war compromise that allowed for a sovereign Germany. So we also have to remember the fears of Britain, France, and the Soviet Union, then Russia, over that Germany. So when now all this talk is, Germany is not doing X, Y, and Z, a lot goes back to those treaties and the fear of Germany. That's now, of course, all changed. Poland, Latvia, they all say, well, the one place I'm not scared of is Germany. Where is Germany? I have zero trust that they will do anything. I mean, that's now completely turned around. The Lithuanians actually want German Bundeswehr people there. But we have a problem in Germany, too, in that because the Bundeswehr is not anymore based on conscription, the type of person who has liked to join the Bundeswehr is perhaps also not of the nicest political thinking, perhaps a bit more on the right wing. So we have also, moral and ethical problems in the Bundeswehr. So yes, the speeches have been strong, but Germany is also still tied into its multilateralist thinking. It has still the baggage of history because it's still sort of viewed by the others, always also in that historical light, for all the demand for Germany should be taking more responsibility. And so we have this problem that Germany, just like the EU actually, is still in that vein of what German political scientists call a civilian power, or what the Germans call not just Zivilmacht, but also zivilisierende Macht. Let's use norms and principles. Let's act multilaterally. Let's always, try and through communication resolve problems. And final point, that of course pertains to Russlandpolitik. Just as well as I do, that of course in America also lots of political scientists and politics people felt that, too little integration of Russia. Of course, all the problems with Russia wouldn't have happened if we had integrated them more. I would argue the opposite. In fact, Germany, under Kohl in the 90s, did a lot for getting Russia onto the table. The G7 membership, the NATO Founding Act, pumping billions of Deutschmarks into Russian democratization and the economy and trying to, help them along. So perhaps actually now it's turned around. Now we say too much. Ostpolitik from Brandt to Schmidt to Kohl to Schröder to Merkel. Plus that we had a chancellor, Schröder, who then has now done self-enrichments by sitting on those boards, which certainly doesn't sit well. So too much, too little Russlandpolitik, a really big question in the German public discourse.
Thank you. So from what you're saying, there is very much a vacuum in Germany, but also a vacuum left by Germany's lack of effective military commitment.
And ability.
Now, of course, the UK is to a certain extent making good that deficiency and has now, as you mentioned, provided bilateral guarantees to Finland and to Sweden to bridge the gap between application to NATO and the kicking in of the Article 5 guarantee. So, Laurie, a question to you would be, what is Britain's unique interest in this? Why is Britain so far out in front? And something that Sir Andrew Cook, who's unfortunately can't be with us this evening, but he wanted to know if Russia attacked Finland and Sweden, would the United Kingdom be committed even up to and including its nuclear capability to respond to such an attack? Would there be an obligation?
Okay, there are several questions in there, one of which I'm going to dodge, I'm afraid, because I think it's just too hypothetical and too difficult to answer. But I mean, at one level, I think one reason why the UK government has taken a relatively forward position, from the outset of this, well, part of it is about having illusions about what you're dealing with and how you deal with it successively erased over time. I have dealt in the second half of my career with the consequences of the Litvinenko poisoning, the Skripal poisoning that happened while I was in Moscow. the 2008 invasion of Georgia. I was there in Moscow at the time. And then the invasion of Ukraine did not start on the 24th of February this year. The military phase of Russia's determination to impose its will on that country really started in late 2013, 2014. But the underlying conflict goes back way beyond that. I mean, back to the Orange Revolution and to the unwillingness to accept in Moscow that actually this country will make its own sovereign choices, because it is, after all, a country and a nation, an imperfect one, a very difficult one, and it is not simply an adjunct of Russia. So what I want to concentrate actually is some of the things that have gone relatively right in the course of this year, and just say a little bit about where we, the UK, might reinforce success. So one of the things that's gone right is, I think, as I said earlier, that we have capitalized on the grotesque errors of judgment made in the Kremlin. I mean, they really are zingers, some of them. But that has opened a path for us to do what needed to be done, to hold back Putin's obvious breaches of international law and the UN Charter, but also to understand actually what's at stake for us here, for all of us. And it's that you don't get to rewrite all of the rules of European security and how you deal with conflicts, particularly in a very crowded and politically complex region like Europe. And nor do you get to play out great power politics through sending tanks into somebody else's country. I think the other thing that's gone right, and it didn't just happen, is mutual deterrence. So we are not in a direct shooting war with Russia. And the reason for that is that it is not in Russia's interests any more than it is in our interests for that to happen. And I think you're making sure that the conditions to keep that logic in play, this is a first order priority for us. So what are they? I think top of the pile for me would be clarity and unity of purpose across the alliance. This is where we succeed or fail. That has largely held. I think if we'd been having this discussion maybe 3 years ago, I would have been considerably less sanguine about that. And the point that leads me to is to think over timescales. This war in Ukraine is nowhere near over, nowhere near. Personally, I don't think it ends until Russia itself fundamentally changes, and that doesn't happen until Mr. Putin and people like him are out of office. So we could be talking years, quite possibly a lot of years, for that to work its way through, and quite possibly a period of turbulence in Russia when change comes to Russia. So during that time, we're going to be carrying out full spectrum defense against this potential adversary, which means not even primarily direct military confrontation, but the things we were talking about earlier, the areas where in the grey zone, the sub-military threshold, where Russia can develop advantage against us. To do that effectively, I think two things are necessary. One is to keep coming back to this question about what is it that created this alliance in the first place, and why does that logic still hold for us, for the Germans, for the Americans, for the Turks, and for the new members and others. So we come at the problem from different directions, but we all converge on the proposition that we are safer with an alliance than without it. And linked to that, electoral cycles, we must now think in terms of electoral cycles. We're 2 years out from the US election. We're 2 years out from the UK election. We're 6 months out from a very difficult election in Turkey, and on around the system. So, going through a difficult winter into a possibly second difficult winter, we've got to carry publics with us. And my final point, at some stage, possibly quite soon, questions will arise about endgames. How does this end? Does it end with a negotiated settlement, or how does it end? My strong advice to all of our political leaders there would be, do not again make the same mistakes that were made in the past, expecting the results to be different. You cannot do deals with Mr. Putin.
Thank you. So in a minute, I'm going to open up to audience questions. But before doing that, I'd like to spend just a couple of minutes on the People's Republic of China, which was mentioned on a number of occasions. I'll turn to Sally in a minute for the tech dimension, if you like. But I'll go first to Nora. If you could tell us perhaps a little bit about the issue, why it's been mentioned that the PRC and the Russians had joint naval exercises in the region, there is a trading route which is now beginning to open up. Can you share with us a little bit what the issues are there and how that might play into our story?
Of course. So China has been, for a number of years already, trying to diversify through land routes what it currently gets through the sea. So you have the Silk Road, of course, initiative, but at the same time for Russia and China, it means that China is trying to use Russia as a resource hub from which they can get cheap raw materials and cheap gas to support the Chinese industry. Now, in this context that we are in today, it's actually easier for China because Russia has less and less routes out to alternative markets. And if you build massive infrastructure projects, which are in great part funded by the Chinese, then you kind of have to play on China's terms. So I think that's where kind of the Russia-China partnership really fits in. You know, Russia needs the market and China needs the resources. So if you think about it, it's somewhat of a mirror in the sense of the German-Russian relationship, except that the Chinese will play by slightly other rules and will be tougher partners for Russia. Now, China in itself is actually really interesting more broadly for this question that we have today on NATO because of the energy side. So right now, of course, we have all of the COVID policies in China which are keeping demand down. But in effect, the more we move towards liquefied natural gas in Europe, which is the primary means that we're using to move away from Russian pipeline gas, the more we will need to compete with Asian demand for the same commodity because it's a global shipping market. And China will play a really key role there. So paradoxically, actually, for us, it might be better if China gets more pipe gas from Russia in terms of prices, but that's a different discussion.
Thank you. And also worth mentioning there the Northern Sea route, which of course links now because of the melting ice, links the PRC and through Russia or Russian waters with Northern Europe. But I'll turn finally to Sally on this question of the PRC's role, because I think we're very much conditioned to think of the PRC as a tech and a cyber power. You know, remember the whole Huawei discussion. Does that play into this story as well, do you think?
Yes, I would say China is, if Russia is using cyber operations as a blunt instrument and a crude instrument, then China is the opposite. You will see a Russian operation. I'm racking my brain to think of a media expose of a Chinese operation and can't think of one in the cyber sphere, which reinforces their reputation as sophisticated, as subtle, and is extraordinarily strategic. So one of the advantages and disadvantages of a cyber operation is you can play with the timeline from minutes and hours to months and years. And I think the Chinese are very much operating in the months and years space, and that is, back to Laurie's point about electoral cycles and so on, is perhaps something they have to worry or concern themselves with less. And they are thinking and operating in a timescale that we can't possibly get our heads around. That plays out into the research that you can see the Chinese doing, which is all very, very long-term and strategic. It's artificial intelligence, quantum computing, it's the impact of the technical environment on human cognition and how it affects the psychology of the human brain, and it's all very, very long-term.
Thank you. Now, unfortunately, we don't have months and years. We only have half an hour for your questions and observations. I know we've got quite a lot of people in the room who have deep backgrounds in the region and these issues, but we also have students and others who've come. You're all welcome to ask questions. It would be helpful when you do so, if you would just say who you are, give your name and your affiliation if you have one. Who would like to begin? Yes, please.
Good evening. Brian Trim, MPhil student and also serving naval officer. There we are. Thank you. Lovely. Thank you for an excellent and informative series of comments, really quite thought-provoking. I'd just like to pick up on where we find ourselves facing challenges. You've quite rightly highlighted the challenges on the flanks, a really good way of conceiving it, the sort of Black Sea, Baltic Sea, and I would argue that even further north into the Baltic or into the Barents rather, We've heard about cyber and full spectrum, which I don't disagree with at all, and I would suggest that that puts our vital area, that both the home islands, but also our sort of European vital area, very much in play. And yet we know that there is a wider game afoot as well. Mali is an example. We know that there's Russian things going on in Libya, their relationship with Egypt. They're sort of vaulting the fence, if you will. The integrated review now under review suggests that we should be tending to the challenge in that wider sphere, what I would describe as the low individual consequence but aggregate problem that we know is happening, as opposed to focusing on the very high consequence but arguably lower probability of a fight in Europe. It's now underway, the review of the IR. I wonder what your thoughts are on balancing perhaps ever more scarce resources across that ever-growing breadth of challenge. Do we need to be worried about the Russians vaulting the fence behind us, or should we just focus on the vitals?
Was that a question for the entire panel or somebody in?
Well, I'd be particularly interested, sir, in your comments,
right.
Your thoughts as you sort of set out the flanks analogy.
So just to save time, what we'll try and do is focus the questions a little bit. But obviously, if anybody has a particular comment to make, please do. Laurie, you start, and then we'll.
Okay. So. First of all, on the specifics of what Russia's offer actually is in places like Mali and so on, I thought for a long time that it's crude and simple and therefore quite effective. And what it basically is we will provide security, no questions asked, and on a fairly unaccountable basis. And we will have a share in the spoils, if you wouldn't mind. And that's quite an attractive deal. And I think the challenge to Western governments is to find a deal that is actually more attractive than that. And of course, that's quite a tall order when you're dealing with failing or failed states and unelected or unaccountable leaders, particularly where there's a high degree of criminality. So I think probably the best way to approach this is to broaden the question out a little bit and just to ask ourselves, what are our first order interests in play here? And for me, a very large part of this, it's what we call the rules-based international system. I mean, Sergei Lavrov has told me to my face a number of times that there is no such thing, we made it up. But that's, he has a unique way of putting that. But the point he's getting across is that, we, meaning the West, have constructed this thing as a way of entrenching our structural privilege and advantage. Not actually since 1945, but since the end of the Cold War. And so what they mean by that sort of thing is when a lot of it goes back to what we think we're doing when, for example, we apply humanitarian intervention. That translates into Russian as regime change, and that's about Russia and about its satellites. So I think to make this really, really concrete, if we wish to mobilize international support against gross challenges to international law, the UN Charter, by Russia and potentially others, you need to bear in mind that you're dealing with getting on for 200 sovereign states who have a different understanding of their order of priorities, their hierarchy of interests from ours. And they also have a different understanding of history from ours. So if we believe that a conflict in Ukraine is top of their pile, we're wrong. Quite often, security of the elite is top of their pile, followed closely by food security or availability, as is often happening. So I think we need to think through actually how we discuss their interests with them if we wish them to agree with us on the overriding importance of international law and of the principles that underlie that.
Just a quick point, I think, which is that I wonder if the debate is too much focused on what we build and use and not enough on how we build and use capability. And by that I mean, how long does it take? What's the supply chain? What's the tech backbone we're using? What's the skill sets? What's the industry base? And I think that is one of the lessons the Russians have learned in Ukraine. They need to pay more attention to that, and others are too.
Thank you very much. Alan Herman from Citigroup. Sally, it was something you said, but then slightly passed over. You said intelligence is key, but we didn't really talk about the intelligence, and there was clearly a massive deficit in the West. The UK and the US were signaling for months, and France and Germany were saying it was not going to happen. And presumably Russia also has a massive intelligence deficit. It didn't actually know how Ukraine would respond, and it didn't understand how the West would respond. So what is the role of intelligence in this game? And to Laurie's point, presumably a lack of intelligence compounds errors of judgment quite massively. So it seems to me going forward, is it Poland inside the EU that has the best intelligence now? But Poland has its own problems with Brussels, and is anyone listening?
We could talk for a long time on this subject. I think there's a huge difference between intelligence, insight, and information. We live in a world that's overrun with information. Intelligence exists, but you've got to know that you can trust it. So there's a long piece I could go into about the importance of trust in a cyber world, but it equally implies in the intelligence world. And I think what you're seeing in some areas is people have the information but can't trust it. In some areas, people have too much information and don't know where to generate insight from. And those of us who are fortunate to have competent intelligence communities should value them.
Kristina.
Yeah, I just would have added that, yes, if you look at it like that from the Anglo-American perspective, that's surely correct. But I would also like to remind you that not just in terms of which countries have a particular history with their neighbor, but also had very good insight by having close connections, through diplomacy and through just living on the border with Russia. So we must just remember, for example, the speech by the Finnish president on New Year's Day last year when he spoke about that what Russia is doing with the amassing of the deployments and by demanding security guarantees is actually already undermining the system and is taking away equal sovereignty of states. And that one has to be very careful and one has to be prepared. And he said a few other things, which comes sort of a bit from folk tradition. If you're not careful, then, your neighbor will take from your house if everything hangs loose. And, that was a bit the perspective by the Baltic states and by Poland as well. So I think they had a much better feeler what was going on, where everybody else was thinking. And that's what I think came so much across with Macron and Schultz, two big continental European powers, the leaders going each in their way to the Kremlin, sitting there at that long table, believing that could somehow deter when a whole machinery was clearly already on the go. And the question was, who was going to be prepared? And in that sense, I think the deterrence and drawing the red lines has been very effective, both for the smaller NATO and non-NATO states.
So very, very briefly, I think there's an immensely powerful learning point in here for all of us, whether you're dealing specifically with Russia and with state-on-state competition, or actually much, much more wider than that. It's about cognitive biases and about believing that X will or will not happen because you want it to happen or don't want it to happen. And we've seen this again and again and again in dealing with Russia, in looking at, of course, the whole inquiries built around this over the use and abuse of intelligence and assessment in the Iraq War and so on. But essentially what we find ourselves doing is saying, this isn't going to happen because it doesn't make sense to me. Well, it just did. So I think there's a point there about turning this to advantage in whatever field we're working in and just asking, are we reading this right? Since we're in a university, in a particular university, I have a specific point here which came up back right at the beginning of March. I was in Cambridge doing a double-headed talk with the Professor of Slavonic Studies here, and we sort of looked at each other and were sort of lamenting about what just happened to our respective fields of expertise. But the point was, after something like this, do you need more or less expertise on Russia or China? Or, and the answer is obvious. So build expertise and build the ability to use it.
Yes, support the Centre for Geopolitics, which does that. Lady, you go ahead, and then Sophie, please. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Kate. I'm a master's student in development studies, and my question is really inspired by you, Susan. So I guess my question is to the energy person and the cybersecurity person. So you said that it's difficult to know who to trust, and I was wondering if you could expand on how do you decide who or what to trust, presuming that you trust yourselves?
Nora.
Sorry, so just to make that a bit more concrete, you mean in day-to-day work, how do we process information, or?
Probably in your respective fields with regards to Baltic geopolitics.
you want to have the first crack? Or?
Yeah, sure. I mean, in my field, so I work with wholesale markets and political risk that impacts that, and think that there are kind of two time frames that we deal with, and essentially the information is very different. So if we deal with what's happening day on day, the headlines that come out that can move the market, actually you don't really need to know if this is accurate or not accurate. What you care about is that you spotted the headline and there was a market move. Then the second level of this is, will this actually have a longer term impact, i.e. change some of the market rules or change some of the targets on energy development, etc. So this is kind of the where we add most value in the work that we do. And for this, I think it's a mix of kind of your own experience, but also talking a lot to people on the field to understand what information they process most. A bureaucrat in Brussels will have a very different perspective than someone in the UK regulator, for example. So it's about knowing your counterparts, and that experience helps you sift through the information to know if it's actually deliverable or not.
Who or what to trust goes to the heart of Laurie's answer, which is you have to have cognitive diversity in the room. So you need different perspectives, you need challenge, you need debate, you need curiosity. The second, longer part, which I can't condense down, is recognizing that in a big data world we need to think differently and we need to ask questions differently, because actually we're getting into that environment where there's a risk that the answer can be what we make it. So again, it plays absolutely to Laurie's point about cognitive bias. Just recognizing this world is different.
Yeah, just maybe adding one more point as well. I think something that many people perhaps don't do enough, and it's something that's growing in the field, is actually going back on your analyses and seeing, was I right or not, and actually training up based on that. Did you use the right information? What was your bias, etc. So in the private sector, I think this is maybe not so much of a practice right now, but it's definitely very important to develop.
Laurie Bristow, in fact, spoke on the subject of trust, and Mr. Putin only 3 days ago here in Peterhouse. I won't ask you to reprise that lecture, but do you have a reply to Kate's
so
question?
the title of my introductory talk was "Lying as an Instrument of Statecraft." There's a sort of basic irreducible fact here, which is that quite often you're dealing with adversaries who use lying or disinformation or the destruction of trust as part of their toolkit against you. Now, the really, really troubling bit for me here is how far we've gone down this own route ourselves in some of the Western democracies in recent years. The sort of very, very short version of the discussion we were having last week is, we depend in a democratic, lawful state on a high degree of trust, or a degree of trust. If you do things that even inadvertently damage that, you damage trusted institutions, you damage your ability to have the sorts of discussions that we were outlining. You're doing your opposition's work for it, really. Sophie.
Hi, firstly, thank you very much for this. So my name's Sophie Bolter. I'm a politics MPhil student. My question's for Laurie. I was wondering if you could talk a bit more about the Ruski Mir civilizational identity. Specifically, I'm quite interested in the ways in which this might put a strain upon the ideas of national identity that kind of underpin the Westphalian nation-state order. Do you think that civilizational identities might become more influential and put a strain on this, or do you think that it will be something that's more limited to Russia? I was thinking perhaps China might adopt this sort of idea.
Well, I'll keep my response to Russia, to keep it sort of short and to the point. The Ruski Mir, the ideology of the Ruski Mir, the Russian world, is something that's been deliberately built up over probably the last 20 or so years, from a base that I think was a lot to do with loss. The end of the Soviet Union, the end of the prestige of that, and trying to work with the sense of nation, or trying to build a sense of nationhood, of linguistic, cultural identity. Of course, the Russian Orthodox Church was heavily built in that. And in some ways, I think it's trying to replace, I mean, I'm grossly oversimplifying, but replacing a sort of, the Bolshevik Party and Soviet communism as an organizing principle for life, but also for power and how power works. One of the many flaws in this is that Russia isn't like that. So Russia is a multi-ethnic federal state. And if you look at some of the practicalities of what's happening in Ukraine, I'm not sure whether this is still the case, but early on in the conflict, a disproportionate amount of the fighting and dying was being done by non-ethnic Russians. So, people who were either semi-conscripted, or they didn't have many other options because they're Buryatians from the east of Baikal region, or ethnic non-Russians or Muslims from some of the southern republics. And I think what is happening is that this ideology contains the seeds of its own destruction, actually, because what it doesn't do is answer the question, how do you modernize a society and a state, which is, of course, the whole point that Putinism is trying to avoid here. And I think the pressures, the losses, the damage that are happening to individuals and families and subgroups within society is really going to stack up for Russia over the next few years. There's an analogy, at least, with the late Soviet period. So that one of the things that quite a lot of people tried very, very hard to ignore in the late Soviet period was the nationalities question. So that the idea that basically in a socialist society nationality is superseded. Well, all Soviet citizens knew that wasn't true, and there were favoured groups and non-favoured groups in the Soviet Union. When things got really, really nasty, inter-ethnic violence broke out. And, of course, national consciousness in Ukraine, around the current and remembered disservices done to that country, as they saw it from Moscow, going back to the famine, the Holodomor, but also the impact of the Chernobyl disaster. These are things that act on people in emotional as much as rational terms and go to their sense of self. I'm kind of looking at Bridget, actually, because you were there at the time, and I don't know whether you want to comment on any of this.
Laurie, I was Moscow correspondent then, when the Soviet Union collapsed, and it is true that the emergence of nationalist movements came almost out of nowhere. It started as different republics asking for their language to have equal status, and then they wanted to have more autonomy, and then rather quickly it became political autonomy, and all these questions from the past arose. I'm very interested, Laurie, that you see a possible analogy today. It's something I've been thinking quite a lot about. The question of whether the Russian world image does not speak to the non-Russians in Russia. One Russian in 9 is a Muslim. What is true is that many of these Russian republics are very poor, so the idea of breaking away would be difficult, because how would you sustain yourself? But that was the argument Gorbachev used against the Baltics, and it didn't work. The other thing that is interesting is that quite a lot of them are peripheral geographically. Buryatia near Mongolia, lots of young Buryat men have gone to Mongolia. The southern part of Russia, people are pouring into Georgia and Azerbaijan. One place that's not true is Tatarstan. If Tatarstan, which has been one of the most nationalistic of the non-Russian republics, were to decide to go its own way, Russia would become a donut.
Thank you. Now we've got 7 or 8 minutes left, so we want to take as many questions as possible. Yes, Donatus?
Thank you. I have a question for the ambassador. It's on Ukraine. Was it not a misjudgment on the part of the West to offer Ukraine NATO membership back in 2008? Because it seems to me that if you had to choose top 5 things out of 100, things that would annoy Russia, or not only that would annoy Russia, but that would essentially break with Russia. So offering Ukraine NATO membership would be one of them. So, if you could turn back time, do you think this decision was still a wise thing to do? Because, for instance, your colleague, Tony Brenton, has a very different view on this. And perhaps my question is then, why do you think this sort of reasoning is wrong, and where does this position get it wrong exactly? Thank you.
So, Laurie, if you answer, and then I think Kristina would also like to respond on that.
Okay, fine. Well, I'll be very brief. I was actually Tony Brenton's deputy at the time in Moscow, at the time of the Bucharest summit decision in 2008. My own view on this, I mean, grossly oversimplified for the sake of time, is that Bucharest was a mistake because it did neither one thing nor the other. So what it did, in summary, was to hold out the prospect. I mean, it said, you know, Ukraine and Georgia will one day become members of NATO, but that's all it said. So in my analysis, what it contrived to do was give the Russians a poke in the eye, but without actually any route to delivering, you know, what we said we'd do. And if you remember, it was not very long after that the Russians invaded Georgia, and I think there was a direct path actually between the two things. It's just worth remembering what what led to that decision, that fudge at Bucharest. It was a fundamental, irreconcilable view between the four central members of NATO, US, UK, Germany and France, with a standoff between particularly the US and Germany over whether this was a good idea or not. And you know, it's a kind of case study in how you can produce a bad outcome by trying to avoid taking a decision one way or the other. That's my personal view.
Kristina,
Tony's wrong, by the way, but that's for another time.
Kristina, you worked on this subject yourself and written about it extensively, so if you could give a brief response.
I think, you know, the business with the prospect was actually the problem, because it was actually this fudge that then came about because Mrs. Merkel effectively said no membership action plan. And why no membership action plan? I mean, you might recall that, of course, there had been lots of wrangling over the first two rounds of NATO enlargement, which countries would be ready, which one would be in which round, that NATO would keep open its open door policy, which, by the way, is not a new policy post-Cold War, but actually the open door was there from the start. Otherwise, West Germany would have never joined NATO, and Spain and whatever. Of course, the unusual thing was that it was Warsaw Pact countries, plus the Balts, plus then anybody else who would consider to be part of that Euro-Atlantic area. And we should also be, however, really clear that the Ukraine of 2008 is not the same country as it was even in 2015, 16, 17. I mean, if we consider, you know, corruption, the instability of the political system, the various revolutions, we must not forget, of course, Euromaidan comes because it's about the association to the EU. So, and NATO was yet another step, and the membership action plan is very clear what kind of levels you have to reach. Never mind that, you know, in the previous rounds of enlargement, also there were parallel processes with trying to attain EU membership and the acquis communautaire, and trying to get through the NATO membership action plan. And we, in terms of stability and democracy and credibility of law and order, all the other countries, they're of a different level than Ukraine and Georgia at the time. So if one takes a very principled view, one could say, well, the Americans, you know, were probably sort of pushing ahead, but, you know, remember also in the 90s, there were different positions being played around. And in terms of, you know, realism, one could have said, well, if we are completely clear about what level a country should have, neither Ukraine nor Georgia were actually ready. So if it's normative, they weren't ready, they weren't at the right level.
Can I just have one sentence to that? So, I mean, this debate is now, you know, we are where we are. But I think the single thing to be most wary of here is a line of logic that says, essentially, we made the Russians invade Ukraine. We did not make the Russians invade Ukraine. They chose to do it.
Okay, now we only have a couple of minutes. I will take the next two questions together. Yes, please.
My question, Laurie, you mentioned about that it's about the long game, really, for Russia, and this isn't going to go away. It's going to go on for a long time. Is it fair to say that this doesn't end with Putin, that he spent 20 years constructing an elite around him, and we need to match our long game to that? Whether that's a fair comment to say that it is going to continue after Putin?
Thank you. And last question at the back. I couldn't see you. Yes. Go ahead. Yeah. Which was you on? Oh, I did. Were there two hands? Were there? Well, we'll have both of you, but please be quick.
Really quick. Thanks. So lots of countries, I'll just speak up, lots of countries are talking about, particularly in the West, about a green transition by sort of 2040. Norway wants to become a green energy superpower. How do you see that affecting the, as dependence on Russian hydrocarbons theoretically decreases, how do you see that altering the way Russia behaves? And I think linked to that, is there an opportunity, obligation to help Russia with their green transition, which I guess could cost trillions of dollars, and is there an opportunity there?
Thank you. And the last question at the back.
Hi, thanks. This question for Kristina. When do you think Germany will be able to square the proverbial circle between international understandings of its Zeitenwende and domestic understandings of its Zeitenwende? Because, of course, after the first Schultz speech, domestically, it was very much lauded as, really taking Germany into new territory. And I think there was a lot of debate as well as, applause for that. Internationally, I think a lot of people thought, well, better late than never. We'll see kind of whether Germany delivers. And of course, now, at a time when the coalition doesn't have quite the same stick, I suppose it did at that point when Schultz made the first speech, is there in fact the political will as well as the domestic support to actually enable Germany to see the Zeitenwende through? Thank you.
Thank you. So we have 3 questions and 3 minutes. Sally, I don't know what any of those you wanted to respond on in particular.
I'll just comment quickly on green transition.
Okay, then
right?
why don't we start with that, then we'll move to Nora and then around via Russia and Germany, please, very quickly.
So energy security, climate security and tech dependency are the same debate, but we have them in 3 different ways.
Nora.
So I think first there is a view that if you just invest in renewables, you kind of don't depend on hydrocarbons anymore. But actually what we should really think about is developing the storage capabilities and bringing them to market, because right now, when renewables are not generating, if there's no wind or there's low sun, it's primarily gas-fired power plants that are cooled up. So the dependence on hydrocarbons is actually a long-term game. So that's one point. The second one is we shouldn't underestimate, as well in the renewable battery storage space, etc., the need for critical materials. And so this requires a review of our supply chains to avoid future such dependencies as we had for Russian gas, but with other parts of the world, in particular China.
Thank you. Germany.
In a nutshell, and my positive hope would be that, there's a public debate now ongoing, and actually a lot needs to also happen to the German public, that there is a willingness to understand, to discuss strategic matters, to talk about defense and security openly without all these old hang-ups. My pessimistic view would be to say, or actually I should have just added, it can only happen with an SPD chancellor, because the CDU was for this anyway. My pessimistic view is that, Scholz will keep writing essays and will keep saying things. And, because of this interplay also with the other powers, which in part are also nuclear powers, Germany will just prefer to play the multilateral card. And unless there's really clear direction also from America how it relates to all the Europeans together, I think this will be problematic.
Laurie, Russia.
Right, okay. Look, I got out of the business of predicting who Putin's successor will be about 12, 13 years ago. We do not know. We do not know who it will be. We do not know when it will happen. We do not know how it will happen. So there is a limit to how much we can usefully speculate on that. What I am starting to think of, though, is of this war as a war of Russia's succession. I think the scale of the damage that Russia has done to itself and that the elite has done to itself is now taking it into that sort of territory. And I think within that, come back to what are the things that you need for a successful transition in an authoritarian society? You need elite unity and you need people off the streets. And at the moment, I think they're going in a different direction, potentially on both of those. And by the way, there is, because this is Russia, not the PRC, there is not a mechanism for the transfer of power. There is no Politburo. This is the analogy I use is a bowl of piranhas, actually. That's how they operate with each other. So what conclusion to draw from that? I think there is one scenario I can pretty much rule out, that Mr. Putin's direct successor is not a Democrat. That is not going to happen. What I find useful to do when trying to think about this is think through scenarios. What are the factors in play here? What are the timescales in play here? What's the sort of weighted likelihood of what you get next? For what it's worth, please don't quote me on this when it happens differently. I think we could be facing a quite turbulent and protracted transition in Russia when the time comes for all of the above reasons.
Thank you. Well, friends, unfortunately, we're out of time, so we have to conclude here, but not before doing three things. First of all, I'd like to thank you, the audience, for turning up. I'd like to thank once again Citigroup for its kind support of this event. And finally, of course, I want to thank our brilliant panel for discussing this, taking us through the different possibilities, and even giving us right at the end a new framing concept of the war of the Russian succession. So you heard it here first, but for now, that's it, and thank you very much.